Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're grappling with something, well, it's a core paradox, really, of constitutional law meeting raw political power. We're setting the scene for a truly seismic event, October 12, 1999, in Pakistan. The moment a fragile democracy was just shattered by a military coup. General Pervez Musharraf. And our whole investigation today really centers on this legal, but also, frankly, deeply unsettling ethical question. When you're faced with overwhelming physical force, can the law itself, the supposed supreme authority, be used to legitimize the very act that overthrew it? I mean, can judicial survival actually come at the cost of constitutional integrity?
That's exactly the tightrope, isn't it? What we're doing today is a really detailed analysis of how Pakistan's Supreme Court responded to that coup. It all crystallized in this landmark 2000 decision, Syed Zafar Ali Shah versus General Pervez Musharraf. And this case, it really represents the judiciary's desperate attempt to preserve its own existence, even if, and this is the kicker, even if it meant bringing back one of the most controversial, some would say toxic, legal ideas in modern constitutional history.
Right, a study in strategic retreat, maybe. Trying to bind a dictator with, well, invisible legal chains. We're relying heavily here on some meticulous research, specifically from episode 15 of the South Asian Judicial Stories Pakistan series. It's called Musharraf Coup, Necessity and Judicial Survival, researched by Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir. So our mission really is to dissect the logic the court used. How did they justify these actions?
Yeah, the core question is just this. What specific legal rationale allowed the Supreme Court to navigate living in the shadow of this new, unelected regime? And critically, what was the institutional price they paid by invoking the Doctrine of State Necessity, a principle, remember, that everyone thought had been buried years ago?
Okay, let's start right there with the collapse itself. October 12, 1999. You said it wasn't a slow-motion crisis. This was sudden, violent, a reassertion of military dominance. So how exactly did General Pervez Musharraf orchestrate the overthrow of Nawaz Sharif's elected government? And what did that look like on the ground, the immediate signs?
Well, the event itself was marked by swift efficiency. It really showed the military's capacity for operational planning, which has its own history in Pakistan. General Musharraf, he was the chief of army staff at the time, and he moved against Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's government after a really complex, very tense political standoff. Now, our sources focus more on the legal aftermath, but the context is crucial. The key moment really involved Sharif trying to remove Musharraf from his post while the general was actually out of the country.
Okay, so there was that power play happening already.
Exactly. And when Musharraf flew back, the military's response was immediate, comprehensive. It wasn't just a political shuffle, it was a complete military takeover. It bypassed every democratic check, every legislative process, the Constitution itself.
And the visual message, you mentioned tanks. That must have been powerful.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The sources confirm it, the physical manifestation of this power shift. Tanks rolling through Islamabad, securing key installations, government buildings, TV stations. When you see armored vehicles seizing the apparatus of state control, I mean, the message to every single citizen, every bureaucrat, and maybe most importantly, every judge is crystal clear. Constitutional governance has just yielded to physical force. And that act right there set the stage for all the subsequent legal decisions made under, well, immense duress.
So that physical takeover translates immediately into this legal and political void.
Right.
What was the single act that really cemented the new regime's authority, the legal blow?
The critical act, you could almost call it the legal suicide note of the existing order, was the suspension of the Constitution. That single action, boom, it instantly vaporized the entire foundational legal framework of the state.
Just gone.
Everything. The office of the Prime Minister, the Parliament, even the Supreme Court itself, legally speaking, they were defunct. Temporarily, at least. Musharraf immediately issued a proclamation, installing himself not as a president or prime minister under the old system, but as the chief executive of Pakistan.
That title, chief executive, it sounds almost corporate, maybe even innocuous. But legally, in this context, what did it really signify?
It signified unbound power. Simple as that. He completely bypassed the existing constitutional hierarchy. Under the Constitution, power is meant to be distributed, limited, checked, balanced, right?
Right.
As chief executive, Musharraf positioned himself as essentially the sole source of law and authority. He wasn't constrained by the suspended legislature or supposedly the judiciary. His orders, which became known as chief executive's orders, they became the immediate law of the land. They just replaced acts of parliament overnight.
And this tension, this recurring cycle of military power versus constitutional rule, it's tragically familiar in Pakistan's history, isn't it? Why does that history, this pattern of coups, make the legal decision we're about to dig into so much more complex, so critical, than if this had been, say, the first time the military stepped in?
Oh, the historical pattern is absolutely everything here. Pakistan had already seen multiple coups, multiple periods of military rule. You had 58, 69, 77, and now 99. And every single time the military succeeded, they found they needed some kind of legal cover, a patina of legitimacy, not just for domestic order, but crucially for international recognition, too. And critically, previous successful coups were often, well, accommodated or even validated by the judiciary using one legal justification or another.
So there's a precedent, a dangerous one.
Exactly. It creates this historical expectation. You called it a legal trap earlier, and that's a good way to put it. When General Musharraf took power in '99, he wasn't operating in a vacuum. He was almost certainly relying on this institutional memory, this expectation that eventually the judiciary would blink. They'd find a way. So for the Supreme Court in 2000, the decision wasn't just about this specific general, Pervez Musharraf. It was about potentially breaking or maybe confirming decades of precedent that basically suggested constitutionalism was negotiable whenever the military decided national stability was supposedly at stake.
So the judges knew. They must have known that just saying, no, this is illegal, full stop, meant facing the historical reality of judges being dismissed, the judiciary potentially being dissolved, and a whole new subservient legal structure being created. That had happened before.
Precisely. The military takeover, by suspending the Constitution, instantly upended the entire legal and political framework. Every appointment, every law, every institution drawing its authority from that Constitution was suddenly floating adrift. So the court's first challenge, its initial decision, was almost existential. Could they reestablish any kind of legal order, any semblance of the rule of law from the vacuum created by that suspension? Because the rule of law had effectively vanished, replaced by the rule of force.
So the judiciary finds itself not just arguing about interpreting the law, but arguing for its own right to exist, and maybe simultaneously arguing for the survival of the state itself, which needs some kind of legal stability, right? Sounds like legal triage.
Triage is a very good word for it, yes.
Yeah.
And the absolute central dilemma was that by even attempting to provide that stability, they risked legitimizing something fundamentally illegal. They had to weigh the possibility of the state collapsing entirely into disorder, which was, of course, the military's core justification for the coup in the first place, against the integrity of the very constitutional document they were sworn to protect.
Okay, so given that gravity tanks in the street, Constitution suspended, it actually seems quite remarkable that people immediately step forward to legally challenge the coup. That takes some serious courage.
It really does, and it speaks volumes, I think, about the tenacity of constitutional lawyers and political activists in Pakistan, even in the face of such overwhelming force. They filed petitions almost instantly, challenging the seizure of power itself. Their argument was essentially, look, regardless of the military's physical power, the Supreme Court remains the ultimate custodian of justice. It's the conscience, even of a suspended constitution. They were demanding that the court declare Musharraf's actions illegal and immediately restore the elected government, the parliament.
And the key petitioner, the name that gives us this title of this landmark case.
That was Syed Zafar Ali Shah. His case became the pivotal legal battleground. Shah and others who filed similar petitions were effectively saying, okay, we acknowledge the reality on the ground, the military takeover, but we demand the immediate restoration of constitutional rule based on the existing legal hierarchy. And this forced the issue. It landed squarely in the lap of the Supreme Court of Pakistan.
Right, and this is where the real institutional drama kicks in, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The case reaches the Supreme Court, which is led at this time by Chief Justice Irshad Hasan, and they're facing the ultimate legal catch-22. If the Constitution is suspended, how can the court, whose entire authority, its whole reason for being, comes from that Constitution? How can it even justify meeting, let alone ruling, on the very act that suspended its own foundation?
It's a paralyzing paradox, absolutely. The court's authority is completely intertwined with the Constitution. Now imagine if they just declared the coup void ab initio illegal from the very start. What happens then?
Musharraf could just dissolve the court.
Exactly. He could simply dissolve the judiciary, maybe install a new, more compliant set of judges, and then the state would be plunged into an even greater constitutional crisis, a total dictatorship with zero judicial oversight. And historically, as we discussed, that kind of response dismissing defiant judges has been the military's playbook in Pakistan.
So the judges were making this calculation: institutional survival versus constitutional purity. If they get abolished, well, constitutionalism loses its last voice, however weak. But if they survive, they might have to compromise their purity, but they retain at least a potential voice, a platform to maybe constrain the regime down the line.
That was the agonizing choice right there. Outright rejection, while it might feel ethically and legally pure, was probably physically impossible to enforce. And it likely would have led to their own abolition. That would have left General Musharraf completely unchecked, no constraints at all. On the other hand, just validating the coup without any conditions, that would mean the court was simply rubber stamping a military dictatorship, maybe even a permanent one, and that would completely destroy its moral authority, its legitimacy in the eyes of the people and the world.
So survival through compromise. That seemed like the only path, maybe, to keep even a sliver of authority. They had to somehow validate the fact of the takeover, the brute reality of power, but at the same time try to limit its scope, its duration. And to do that, they needed some kind of legal justification, a shield, to acknowledge this illegal reality without completely surrendering to it.
Precisely. And this is where they began that deep dive, that search through the dusty archives of contentious legal history. They were looking for a doctrine, any doctrine, capable of justifying an act of illegality on the grounds of some greater good, some overriding necessity. They needed a concept strong enough to seem plausible given the military's current power, yet flexible enough to allow the court itself to impose conditions, to set limits. And that search led them directly, maybe inevitably, back to the doctrine of state necessity.
Okay, the doctrine of necessity. Now, Supreme Court took quite a while, didn't they? 7 months, from October 99 to May 2000, to deliver this verdict. That length of time itself suggests, well, intense internal debate, maybe negotiation, certainly pressure. And when they finally deliver the judgment, the source material is clear. They relied pretty much entirely on this controversial doctrine of state necessity. Let's define this concept carefully for everyone listening. What exactly is it? And then crucially, why was bringing it back such an explosive move?
Right. So the doctrine of state necessity, in essence, is this proposition. When the established constitutional order collapses or breaks down, and the state itself faces some kind of existential threat, think anarchy, civil war, a total collapse of governance, then actions taken outside the Constitution, extra-constitutional actions, by whoever is effectively in charge, in this case the military, to restore order and preserve the nation. Well, those actions can potentially be validated retroactively by the courts. It kind of operates on that old, very pragmatic maxim that necessity knows no law, necessitas non habet legem.
It sounds like a pragmatic tool, maybe a necessary evil for extreme situations where legal theory just has to give way to harsh reality. But you said this tool wasn't just sitting there waiting to be used. It had to be resurrected. Why was reviving it in 2000 seen as such a monumental and, for many, a devastating legal step?
Because the Supreme Court of Pakistan itself had already, in a previous very famous moment of judicial strength and defiance, explicitly repudiated this doctrine. They had tried to permanently bury it. That key moment was the 1972 judgment in the incredibly famous Asma Jalani case.
Okay, let's pause here and dedicate some time to Asma Jalani. Why was that 72 ruling considered such a landmark, such a radical declaration of judicial independence at the time?
Well, Asma Jalani came in the immediate aftermath of the 1971 war, the trauma of the breakup of Pakistan and the creation of Bangladesh. The Supreme Court, then led by Chief Justice Hamidur Rahman, finally decided it was time to take a hard line against military interference in politics. In the Asma Jalani judgment, the court explicitly reversed the legal justifications, including versions of the necessity doctrine that had been used to validate the previous military regimes of Ayub Khan in '58 and Yahya Khan in '69.
So they looked back and said, those previous validations were wrong.
Exactly. The 1972 court declared, quite unequivocally, that a coup d'etat, or a revolution, as the previous dictators like to euphemistically call it, was nothing more and nothing less than high treason under the Constitution. They declared that military rule could never be justified under the doctrine of necessity. They even labeled past judicial validations as basically concessions made under duress, mistakes that shouldn't be repeated. Asma Jalani was supposed to be the final word. It was meant to establish a clear, immutable legal barrier. Coups are illegal, full stop. And the judiciary will never again recognize them as legitimate, no matter the circumstances.
Wow. So when the 2000 court, facing Musharraf, decided to invoke the doctrine of necessity again, they weren't just setting a new precedent for this case. They were consciously, deliberately overriding 28 years of binding precedents set by their own institution's history. They were essentially saying that the crisis of 1999 was so profound, so existential, that it somehow negated the hard-won constitutionalism established back in 1972.
That's precisely the weight of the decision. The source material makes it crystal clear. The doctrine was the tool they used. And the ratio de sedendi, the core legal justification for the judgment, was that the military takeover of October 12, 1999, was being validated, justified under necessity. And the specific justification given was that this action, this illegal action, was required to prevent state collapse.
How did the court articulate that state collapse? What specifics did they point to? What evidence or argument did they accept from Musharraf's regime to justify this extreme measure?
Well, the court essentially accepted the narrative put forward by the military regime. The argument was that the civilian government under Nawaz Sharif had become functionally paralyzed. They cited widespread corruption, deep institutional gridlock, constant political infighting, and a collapsing economy as evidence that the state machinery was grinding to a halt. Now, the court didn't really conduct its own independent investigation into these claims in the judgment itself. It largely adopted the regime's view that the constitutional machinery had effectively ceased to function. And therefore, the court argued, this temporary illegal intervention, the coup, was justified as a necessary evil to safeguard the stability and the very existence of the Pakistani state.
Okay, so they accept the premise of necessity. But if they were going to use such a dangerous, historically loaded tool, they surely had to be careful not to just hand Musharraf absolute unchecked power. And this seems to be the crucial point for you, the listener, to grasp. The court validated the coup, yes, but with limits. They tried, at least on paper, to put legal chains on the chief executive.
Yes, they engaged in what you could call a very sophisticated act of judicial management, or maybe damage control. They recognized the reality of Musharraf's power. They couldn't deny the tanks, but they refused to recognize the legality of his power as being absolute or permanent. So they imposed 3 really crucial limiting conditions. These conditions were intended to ensure that the suspension of the Constitution was temporary and that the fundamental constitutional identity of Pakistan was preserved even during this period of military rule.
All right, let's delve deep into those conditions.
Yeah.
They represent the judiciary's strategy for survival, perhaps. What was the first condition? It dealt with the status of the Constitution itself, right?
Condition 1. Constitutional supremacy. This was fundamental. The court mandated that the Constitution, despite being temporarily suspended in its operation, remained the supreme law of the land. Now, that sounds maybe a bit paradoxical, but it's an enormously subtle and potentially powerful statement. It meant that Musharraf couldn't just govern in a complete legal vacuum. His actions were framed as merely executive steps taken during an emergency. The court explicitly reserved the right to review those actions later, judging them against the spirit and the underlying intent of the suspended Constitution. They were effectively telling Musharraf, you're operating under an emergency license right now, granted by us out of necessity. This is not permanent ownership of the state.
Okay, so they insisted the document itself still had force, even if its day-to-day rules were paused. That seems to lead directly into the second constraint, which sounds perhaps even more critical concerning permanent changes.
Condition 2, immutable features. This was huge. The court explicitly ruled that the new regime General Musharraf could not amend the Constitution's basic features. This was a direct attempt to build a fence around Pakistan's fundamental democratic and constitutional identity. This concept, the basic structure doctrine, it has really deep roots in South Asian jurisprudence, doesn't it? It particularly comes from that landmark Indian Supreme Court ruling, Kesavanda Parati.
Right, so they were borrowing this powerful legal theory from India, essentially, to protect core elements like what? The parliamentary system, judicial independence, federalism, fundamental rights, things like that.
Precisely those kinds of things, the core pillars of the state's identity.
How effective was that constraint likely to be in practice, though? Did it really stop Musharraf?
Well, legally, it was paramount. It was a clear red line drawn by the court. Its practical enforcement, of course, depended heavily on the court's continued existence, and frankly, its bravery in the future. But by protecting these immutable features, the court aimed to curtail Musharraf's ability to transition smoothly from being just a temporary military ruler into a permanent constitutional dictator by simply rewriting the rulebook to suit himself. So the idea was, okay, he could issue orders to maybe clean up corruption, manage the economy, things deemed necessary for stability, but he could not fundamentally alter the nation's democratic skeleton. And importantly, this provided a future legal basis for challenges if, or perhaps when, the regime inevitably tried to secure its position more permanently down the road.
So, in essence, the court was saying, okay, necessity means you can occupy the house during this emergency, maybe rearrange the furniture, but you absolutely cannot knock down the structural walls or change the foundations. Okay, that makes sense. Now, the third condition, the one that really put a clock on this whole arrangement.
Condition 3, deadline for restoration. And this was perhaps the judiciary's boldest assertion of control within the compromise. The court asserted its authority by granting General Musharraf a strict and supposedly non-negotiable deadline. 3 years. That was the timeline, meaning elections had to be held and constitutional rule fully restored by May 2003.
3 years. I have to push back a bit here. A 3-year deadline sounds definite, yes, but didn't that just explicitly legitimize a military dictator for 1,095 days? You have to wonder, was the court setting a genuine limit here? Or was it actually providing a fairly long-term contract for the military to consolidate power, clean house, stabilize things, and then maybe ensure a political transition that suited them?
That is precisely the criticism, the core moral dilemma that has haunted this decision ever since it was made. You're right. Legal purists, constitutional fundamentalists, they argue that granting even one single day of legitimacy to an illegal act, like a coup, is fundamentally wrong. It compromises the entire system. However, the defenders of the court's decision argue differently. They'd say that by setting that deadline, even 3 years out, they established a concrete mechanism for Musharraf's future accountability. Without that deadline, who knows? He might have aimed to stay for 10 years, indefinitely. The court used the deadline as leverage. It ensured, on paper at least, that the suspension was time-bound. And it also ensured that the judiciary itself, through its power of review, would remain relevant and necessary come 2003, when that deadline expired. It was a calculated trade-off, legitimacy now, in exchange for some constraint later.
A gamble, really. And what was the overarching legal principle, the maxim, that the court leaned on to justify this incredibly difficult choice, choosing survival and pragmatism over immediate constitutional fidelity?
They anchored the entire judgment, the moral justification, on that ancient Roman legal principle, salus populi est suprema lex.
Salus populi est suprema lex. The welfare of the people is the supreme law.
Exactly. The court's key observation, the line that really sums up their rationale, was basically, the principle of salus populi est suprema lex demands that the state must continue even if the Constitution is temporarily suspended. This maxim provided them with the moral high ground, so to speak, for making this compromise. They argued that the perceived dysfunction and corruption of the previous civilian government under Sharif had created such a dire situation that this temporary sacrifice of the letter of the law, the coup, was necessary to save the nation itself, the people, from complete chaos and collapse.
So by shifting the justification away from pure legality, which they obviously couldn't uphold given the coup, and towards this idea of existential necessity, the welfare of the people, they tried to make their accommodation, their compromise, seem more palatable, both perhaps domestically and certainly internationally. They weren't just saving Musharraf's regime, they argued. They were saving Pakistan itself.
It was, you have to admit, quite brilliant legal maneuvering in a way, leveraging a very powerful, historically resonant maxim to provide cover for what was, at its heart, a profound political accommodation with military power. But of course, the critics would immediately jump in and ask, well, who gets to determine the welfare of the people in such a situation? Is it the court? Or is it the man with the guns, the man with the tanks? And the historical pattern in Pakistan, unfortunately, often suggested that it was the military that defined the necessity, and the courts then merely found a way to ratify it after the fact.
Okay, so we have this verdict. The coup is validated, but supposedly constrained by these conditions. What did this decision actually mean for the judiciary's own standing, its integrity? You mentioned the judgment immediately placed judicial independence under intense scrutiny. So had the court genuinely protected the Constitution by preserving its basic features and setting that deadline? Or had it, in reality, merely ensured its own survival within the new power structure created by Musharraf?
That is the absolute core, the enduring debate around this case. The moment the court validated the coup, even with conditions, it inevitably faced accusations of being, well, an accomplice after the fact. Now, the argument for survival is strong. You can see the logic. By staying in place, by not being abolished, and by imposing those 3 conditions, they retained at least the theoretical power to enforce the deadline later on and to protect those basic features. They limited the damage, arguably.
The argument against.
The argument against is equally compelling, isn't it? By providing legal cover for an illegal act, they essentially institutionalized a potential mechanism for future coups. They sent a signal, intentionally or not, to the military. If your intervention is clean enough, if the political atmosphere is sufficiently volatile, well, the courts will likely find a way to recognize the new reality eventually. Constitutionalism itself lost credibility because its ultimate defender, the judiciary, appeared to choose pragmatism, survival, over fundamental principle.
And this brings us right back to the historical weight of reviving this doctrine of necessity, especially after the Asma Gilani case had tried so hard to inoculate the legal system against it, to bury it for good. What was the real fallout of reversing that progressive defiant precedent from 1972?
The reversal fundamentally damaged the momentum towards greater judicial independence in Pakistan. Asma Gilani had represented this high watermark, an attempt to establish judicial review as a solid, unbreachable barrier against military overreach. By reviving necessity in 2000, the court effectively reestablished that judicial review wouldn't necessarily be a barrier, but perhaps more of a manager of military interventions, a way to regularize them after the fact. They lowered the constitutional bar, essentially suggesting that the rule of law, at the end of the day, is ultimately subservient to the perceived needs of the state, especially as defined during a crisis, often by the military itself.
Okay, let's look at that period between the judgment in 2000 and the next big crisis point in 2007. How did General Musharraf actually operate under these supposed constraints, particularly that 3-year deadline for restoring democracy? Did he respect the court's limits? Did he challenge them during that time?
Well, initially, Musharraf certainly seemed to adhere to the letter of the law, the conditions imposed by the court. He needed that judicial validation to consolidate his rule. However, as that May 2003 deadline approached, he clearly needed to solidify his own position for the longer term. The court had constrained him significantly, especially that point about not changing the basic features of the Constitution. So when the deadline arrived, what did Musharraf do? He held a pretty controversial referendum in 2002 to get himself elected president for 5 years, effectively extending his term. But he also did facilitate the general elections that the court had mandated for 2003. Now, critics would say those elections were held under a very carefully managed framework, the legal framework order, designed to maximize military influence and ensure a pliable parliament.
So he met the deadline for elections, sort of, but in a way that kept him in charge.
Exactly. And critically, he then used that newly elected, arguably controlled parliament to push through constitutional amendments like the 17th Amendment, designed to consolidate his own power as president, embedding many of the powers he'd held as chief executive into the restored constitution. He essentially used the temporary legitimacy granted by the court back in 2000 to manage a political transition that kept him firmly in power, just shifting his title from the court-legitimized chief executive to a constitutionally amended, powerful president.
It really sounds like the constraints worked just enough to force a procedural return to civilian rule. A facade, maybe, but not nearly enough to prevent the underlying military authority from retaining ultimate control. The compromise bought time, but the ruler's ambition remained constant.
That distinction is absolutely key. The compromise in 2000 ensured the physical survival of the Constitution as a document and the survival of the judiciary as an institution, but it fundamentally failed to deter the military from seeking to permanently institutionalize its political role. And this leads us directly, as you said, to that great test, the confrontation of 2007, which the source material points out was directly foreshadowed, maybe even made inevitable, by the logic of the 2000 judgment.
Tell us about that direct connection. The source emphasizes that the same doctrine of necessity would be tested again just 7 years later. How did that play out?
Well, by 2007, things had shifted. Musharraf's own legitimacy, even the legitimacy granted back in 2000, was wearing thin. His political decisions were facing increasing challenges from a revived judiciary. This judiciary was now more confident, more assertive, especially after that 2003 transition back to democracy. The Supreme Court, now led by a different, more activist Chief Justice, Iftikhar Muhammad Chaudhry, began to actively exercise the very powers of judicial review that the 2000 judgment had, technically, preserved. They started challenging Musharraf on really crucial, sensitive decisions, things like privatization deals, disappearances, human rights issues.
So the judiciary started using the voice it had arguably saved for itself back in 2000 to actually constrain the very ruler who had been legitimized back then. The chickens coming home to roost, perhaps.
Exactly. And Musharraf clearly viewed this growing judicial assertiveness as a direct threat to his continued rule, his power. His assumption, likely based on that 2000 precedent, was probably that the courts would always ultimately submit when the military asserted its power decisively, that necessity would always trump principle. So, in November 2007, when he felt his presidency, his tenure, was genuinely threatened by potential court decisions against him, he took the most drastic step imaginable. He imposed emergency rule again. And crucially this time, he suspended the judiciary itself. He tried to preemptively remove Chief Justice Chaudhry and dozens of other dissenting judges from office.
Oh, wow. The ultimate irony, then. The survival strategy of 2000, validating the coup under necessity, directly resulted in the judiciary's own suppression in 2007. The very man validated by the doctrine of necessity then turned on the institution that had legitimized him.
It seems like the almost inevitable outcome of that original compromise, doesn't it? When a military ruler is granted legitimacy under duress, under necessity, they may come to perceive that authority as inherent, as earned, not as something temporary or conditional granted by the court. So when the conditional nature of that rule starts to bite, when the court actually tries to exercise the constraints it set, the ruler's next step isn't negotiation, it's often elimination of the constraint itself. In this case, the judiciary.
But the response on the ground in 2007 was fundamentally different from the relative quiet after the 1999 coup, wasn't it? The source highlights that this suspension of the judiciary sparked a massive, sustained lawyers' movement that ultimately played a huge role in restoring democratic order. Why did the public, and especially the legal community, mobilize so powerfully in 2007 when they were comparatively passive or perhaps just stunned back in 1999?
Yeah, that's a critical difference. Several factors were likely at play. Firstly, the target in 2007 was incredibly clear and symbolic. Musharraf wasn't just overthrowing a potentially unpopular civilian government, he was directly attacking a sitting high-profile Chief Justice and the judiciary as an institution. That resonated differently. Secondly, the lawyers, and indeed much of the politically aware public, had had 7 years to observe the consequences, the failures, the compromises that flowed from that 2000 validation. They'd seen where accommodating military rule under necessity ultimately led. There was less illusion, perhaps.
So they'd learned from history.
Arguably, yes. And the lawyers' movement skillfully used the very idea of constitutional supremacy, the principle that the 2000 court had technically preserved. Even while compromising it, they used that as their central rallying cry. It transformed what could have been just a legal or institutional crisis into a massive civil society movement. People were on the streets demanding the restoration of the suspended Chief Justice, and by extension, demanding the restoration of the fundamental integrity of the Constitution itself. It was, in effect, a massive popular pushback against the entire philosophy underpinning the doctrine of necessity.
That's fascinating. That shift from the judicial compromise of 2000 to the massive public and lawyers' resistance in 2007, that really feels like the ultimate legacy of the Syed Zafar Ali Shah case, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The court's institutional survival might have been secured back in 2000, but it took the conscience of the nation, as the source puts it, awakened perhaps by those very compromises, to truly fight for and eventually restore a semblance of constitutional order.
It really demonstrates, I think, that the ultimate constitutionality of a state isn't solely determined by what judges write in their judgments, especially judgments made under pressure. It's also determined by the popular will, the societal commitment to actually enforce those constitutional principles. The Compromise of 2000 might have been seen by the court as a necessary survival tactic at the time, maybe the least bad option. But the resistance of 2007, fueled by that earlier compromise, arguably became the true, albeit delayed, victory for constitutionalism in Pakistan.
It strongly suggests that any legality granted under duress, under necessity, is inherently unstable. And eventually the pushback against that initial compromise, whether from the courts or the streets, is what truly defines the nation's ongoing legal and political future. Hashtag outro. Well, this has been a truly fascinating and quite intricate deep dive into the very real limits of judicial power when faced with military force. To try and synthesize this complex story, what the Supreme Court achieved, or perhaps was forced to achieve, in Syed Zafar Ali Shah versus General Pervez Musharraf was this incredibly difficult, painful, and yes, highly controversial act of institutional preservation. They chose, under immense pressure, to validate the extralegal seizure of power by General Musharraf, using the doctrine of necessity, a legal principle that many believed and hoped was dead and buried.
But, and this is the crucial but, in exchange for granting that validation, they simultaneously attempted to impose powerful, though as we saw ultimately contested, legal chains on that power. They mandated the continued supremacy of the Constitution, at least in theory. They prohibited the amendment of its basic features. And they set that hard 3-year deadline for a return to democratic rule. It was, looking back, a desperate tightrope walk, an attempt to manage a revolution that they simply could not defeat outright.
The source material we've been drawing on leaves us with a really powerful reflection on this whole saga. It perfectly encapsulates that tension between law and liberty, legality, and power. It says, every time the Constitution sleeps, the conscience of the nation awakens and reminds us that legality without liberty is merely silence under power.
That statement just cuts right to the heart of it, doesn't it? Especially concerning the doctrine of necessity. While the court in 2000 secured a temporary fragile legality for the new regime and, yes, ensured its own physical survival as an institution, the years that followed, particularly 2007, demonstrated vividly that true constitutional legitimacy requires much more than just a judicial sanction delivered under duress. It requires genuine freedom, genuine accountability. That silence under power, which characterized the immediate aftermath of 2000, eventually became the thunder, the roar of the lawyers' movement in 2007.
And so, we'll end this deep dive, as always, with a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to consider, directly based on this material. If a court is forced into a position where it feels it must choose between the survival of the state itself using an ethically murky, historically compromised legal tool like the Doctrine of Necessity and the survival of the Constitution, which is supposed to define and limit that very state, does the fact that they even face that choice prove that the Doctrine of Necessity is inherently a political tool rather than a purely legal one? And perhaps more importantly, when a court chooses institutional survival through compromise over immediate, perhaps suicidal defiance, does it truly save the institution in the long run? Or does it simply postpone a necessary, perhaps even more profound reckoning?
We leave you to consider that heavy price. The price paid when judges find themselves in the impossible position of deciding whether to save the ship of state, but only by throwing the rulebook, the Constitution itself, overboard, even temporarily.
Until next time on The Deep Dive, keep digging deeper.